Amen. Well, we are going to talk as soon as this kicks in. There we go. Okay. It's the obligatory microphone malfunction. A talk wouldn't be the same without it. So a reason for our hope. I'm taking that from 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, where Peter writes that we should be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. And this is, I think, the best scriptural passage that explains what apologetics is all about. What is apologetics? Well, apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which means to give a defense, to defend something. So Peter is saying that we should be able to give a defense for our faith, for the reason that we have hope. Now, sometimes people think that apologetics and evangelization are kind of the same thing. And they're not. Because people sometimes think if I just know all the right arguments, if I study all the things, I can just argue people into the church. You're laughing because you know it doesn't work, right? And you're probably laughing because you've tried, right? You've probably tried to argue someone into the church. But even though apologetics is not the same thing as evangelization, they are connected. Because what apologetics do is they clear some of the misconceptions, the lies, the false religions, the false worldviews that people have believed that are in the way blocking them from receiving the gospel. So if you're a gardener, you'll know that you have to weed before you seed, right? You have to get rid of the weeds or else the seed won't be able to grow. What you do with apologetics is you clear away some of that false stuff that people believe so that they can receive the truth. If you're talking to an atheist about the love of God, they're not able to receive that because they don't even believe there is a God, right? If you're trying to tell a Muslim about how Jesus is God who became man to set you free, this is how you can be reconciled with God, he's going to say, yeah, I don't even believe Jesus is God. So you're going to have to start in a different place. But apologetics is not the end. You're aiming towards proclamation of the gospel. That's always the end goal. So arguing can actually be good. In our culture, we're not used to arguing being seen as something good, mostly because people don't know how to do it anymore. Arguing has become a lost art. It just turns into one side screaming at the other side and not listening, or on the other side, people just saying, well, I'm not going to argue, let's just agree to disagree. Right? Somewhere in the middle is a key to a good argument where you present yourself clearly, strongly, but you respect the other person. And one of the best ways to ensure that you're doing it this way is to remember that you're trying to win a person, not an argument. If you are making the other person lost so that you can make yourself win the argument, you are not doing apologetics right. You need to remember that your heart needs to be in the right place towards the other person. I was at Wayne State University talking with students passing by about Jesus, and I got into this conversation with a young Muslim guy named Muhammad, of course. So Muhammad and I were talking for about 45 minutes, and man, was he passionate. He had his Quran with him, he had all of his Islamic arguments, and we were just going back and forth, back and forth. But at the end of the conversation, he said to me, you know, through this whole conversation, I felt like you and I were brothers. And I said, Muhammad, I agree with you, because we can argue about things that we're passionate about, but we can still treat each other with love. And we shook hands, and both of us left with smiles on our faces. He didn't back down from his beliefs. He did not hold back. He was very passionate. Same with me. I didn't back down either. But both of us were able to have this argument. It can happen. So what I want to do with you today is walk you through 3 basic apologetics that you can basically use like a Swiss Army knife on any person. Because basically if you know these 3, you'll be able to at least say something to anyone, no matter what their background is, in defense of your faith. The first 2 are focused more on speaking to someone about evidence for God, so people who don't believe in God. And the third one is basically the catch-all for any other religion as to why Christianity is the true one. So we're going to talk about how there's evidence for God as the creator, how there's evidence for God as the moral lawgiver, and how there's evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, This is a very important passage for us to understand how the relationship between an atheist and God is. What's going on in the atheist's heart. And it's a little bit intense, but God is intense sometimes when he speaks. So it says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against men who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. So what God's word is saying is that it should be evident when we look out at creation that there is a creator, that there is some kind of God who we owe worship to, that is clear just from reason alone, just from looking out alone. But that in order to not worship that God, in order to not believe in that God, you need to do a certain kind of tricking of yourself. You need to suppress that truth to keep it bottled up so that you can't admit it. And then it says, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. It's like, dun, dun, dun. It's a sobering thought. Their foolish hearts were darkened. And when we look out at the universe, and this is, you can imagine yourself talking with an atheist in this. When you are looking out at the universe, you can see all of this stuff. The stars, the sun, the moon, the earth, all the trees, all the plants, all the animals, us. And you can say to yourself, where did all of this come from? Right? You can maybe even think about yourself, where did I come from? Well, I came from my parents. Where did they come from? Okay, they came from my grandparents, great-grandparents, all the way back in history. So there's always a cause that comes before something else. It has to have a reason for why it exists. So if you're talking with an atheist, you can play this game. It's really fun. You can act like you're a toddler and just asking, where did that come from? Where did that come from? Where did that come from? And you just work your way all the way back. Well, humans came from monkeys, and then monkeys came from some rodent-like creature, and then those rodent-like creatures maybe came from a lizard that crawled out of the ocean one day, and that fish developed from a bacteria. Where did the bacteria come from? Well, it came from some kind of matter that became alive, and where did that matter come from? Eventually, you'll get to something that they'll say, the Big Bang. Now, no one really knows what the Big Bang is when you're talking with them. Scientists know, but the average person you're talking with won't know what the Big Bang is, really. But they'll say, well, there's some kind of electrons that hit some other matter, there was energy, and it all just kind of exploded, and that's where the universe came from. And then you just keep asking, well, where did those electrons come from? Where did the energy come from? At a certain point, they will have to admit, I don't know. I don't know where that came from. And this is your in. This is your in to present them the truth about God as our creator. You can tell them that nothing comes from nothing, right? If there's nothing, something just doesn't pop into existence. There needs to be a cause for it. And there can't be infinite regress, which means there can't be just being stretching back into eternity. There has to be a cause that started all of this. That just is what makes logical sense. There was a European missionary who was evangelizing an Indian, and he was asking this Indian man where he thought the foundation of the world was. And the Indian man said, well, it's on the back of 4 elephants. And the European missionary said, okay, and what are the elephants on? And he said, well, it's on the back of a turtle. And he said, well, what's the turtle on? And the Indian guy thought for a second. He's like, I don't know. I guess it's turtles all the way down, right? I guess it's turtles all the way down. This is silly, right, for us to think about, but modern scientists are talking about this nowadays. They're not talking about turtles, but they're talking about things like, multiverses, that multiverses have just existed forever. It's their own version of turtles all the way down. It doesn't make sense. That's what God is talking about when he says their foolish minds were darkened. When you reject God, when you suppress that truth, you are reduced to absurdity. So what we need to say then is there must be some necessary being that has to exist. Because you and me, we don't have to exist. We're called contingent beings. That means if my parents didn't meet, I wouldn't be here. If that tree outside didn't have someone plant a seed a long time ago, it wouldn't be here. Something has to exist in and of itself. And that is what we call God. God is being itself that is the foundation for all other existence, all other being. He is the cause. And you can take it a step farther and say, not only did he cause things, but we look out and we see that there's an intelligence. There's a design to the universe that we live in. The laws of physics, the intricacy of our universe. If you were walking down a beach and you saw a laptop sitting on the ground, would your first thought be, wow, this laptop, it's so cool that the universe just kind of by happenstance just made this. That the sun baked, the ground at just the right thing, and the earthquake maybe happened and brought this copper wire up, and then the waves came and hit the sand and made it into glass, and it all just fit into this beautiful laptop. Isn't that amazing? No, it's foolishness. It's absurdity. And yet people do the same thing with our universe. Atheists look out at our world and they say, this all just kind of happened randomly. But you look out at the fact that our earth is perfectly situated to house life, perfectly from the sun, not too hot, not too cold. The intricacy of the human body, that despite all of our attempts with technology, we can't make a machine that's even close to how our body works with its system and organs. This points to not only a creator, but an intelligent creator who designed it. Okay, second one is God is our moral lawgiver. So this means that we have the ability to sense that there is good and evil. In Romans chapter 2, verse 14 and onward, Paul is talking about the Gentiles. These are non-believers, people who haven't received God's revelation of the law. But this is what he says about them, about non-believers. He says, when Gentiles who have not the law do by nature what the law requires, they are a law to themselves even though they don't have the law. So they show that what the law requires is written on their hearts. So he's saying that even though God told the Israelites, you shall not kill, you shall not steal, you shall not lie, you shall not commit adultery, and the Gentiles haven't received those laws, they still know deep down, I shouldn't kill people. I shouldn't cheat on my wife. I shouldn't steal things. They know because it's written in their heart. They can recognize it. And so Paul is saying that the non-believers have the ability to sense good and evil in actions. And we know that this is true as well with people who are non-believers today. They will know, we all know what is right and what is wrong. To put it the most bluntly, we know that it's wrong to eat our neighbor, but we know it's good to help our neighbor. Right? This is like the most basic thing. Don't eat your neighbor, help your neighbor. Like cannibalism is wrong. Murder is wrong. Stealing is wrong. We know these things. You can ask an atheist, why? Why do we know this? Because from an atheistic perspective, there is no standard, no real reason why it's better to help your neighbor than to eat your neighbor. Now, they are going to try and figure out a way to prove it to you, but they won't have one. They'll try and say, well, maybe it's my individual conscience. Like, we all know that it's wrong. And I'll say, well, there's a lot of people out there who commit all kinds of horrible things against other people. Obviously, it seems that personal conscience isn't enough. Otherwise, we just have chaos. Everyone's saying, well, I feel like it's okay for me to steal your stuff. You don't feel that. Well, they say, okay, well, maybe it's society. Maybe society all gets together and we pass laws that maybe affect the most people for good and hurt the least amount of people. You could say, well, okay, that is one way to define morality. But I think that society has been wrong in the past. Right? We can look at something in our own country like slavery. You could say, well, in some ways slavery helped the economy. In some ways slavery helped certain people rise to wealth. But you're forgetting about the huge section of people that weren't, right? So the moral law cannot just be based on if it benefits some people or what a society determines, because now we look objectively in the past and say that was an evil, and we apply a standard to it. And then they say, well, maybe it's just might makes right. If I have the power to make the laws, then I define what's moral. And people will actually believe this. But then you look at people like Adolf Hitler. He had the power, and he made laws. And we look back at those laws now with complete horror at what was done because he had the power to do so. And so some atheists at this point might get to the point of a guy who I was talking with in Florida. I was evangelizing him, and he said, okay, I guess there is no objective morality. There is no such thing as good or evil. There's just random acts. And I said, well, surely slavery was evil. Surely the Holocaust was evil. And he said, well, not in themselves. There's nothing wrong with them in themselves. I may find them personally distasteful. I might not like them. There's nothing wrong about them. And with someone whose conscience is this warped, is this disordered, you can see how they are suppressing the truth of God, right? Because they don't actually believe that, but they have to say it in order to keep their belief that God is not real. And so I said to him, look, we live according to what we think is true, right? We know that gravity works, so we don't walk off buildings, okay? You are saying that you don't believe that there's good and evil, but you don't live that way. If someone was to steal your stuff, you would try and get it back because you're like, no, that's wrong. If you were seeing some woman getting attacked in the street, you would call 911 or you would step in. You act as if there is good and evil, even though you're saying that there isn't. And so you know deep down that there is a God. You know because God's law is the standard. This immaterial law that is written in our heart supposes that there's some immaterial lawgiver that has written it, that he's imposed a moral structure on his creation, and we're in his creation, so guess what? We get to play by his rules. He's set the moral code forward. Whatever is according to his nature, which is good, he's good, goodness itself, that is what's good. We recognize that, and everyone can recognize that regardless of their faith. And so for an atheist to have good and evil, he has to borrow from our worldview because he's suppressing the truth about God. Okay, finally, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This you can use with any other person who believes in any other religion to say Jesus is the one who has founded the true religion, Christianity, Catholicism, because he's the only one who by his own authority has been raised from the dead. And we have good evidence for the fact that he did. That's why Paul says, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. And we are of all people the most to be pitied. Like without the resurrection, Catholicism is utterly useless. Christianity is useless if Jesus didn't rise. It's all just this big myth. But Jesus did rise. And we have good evidence that he did. So, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we can know it because A, Jesus really died. B, the tomb was empty afterwards. C, the apostles were martyred for telling that story. 4 women testified to the fact that the resurrection happened. Then there was 500 eyewitnesses who saw Jesus. And finally, skeptics and even enemies saw Jesus after his resurrection. We're going to run through this quickly, but by all means come and talk to me afterwards and I can explain more in depth about why we know from history that this took place. So I was once talking with, again, another Muslim, and he was telling me that he actually didn't think that Jesus died, that he thought that he just kind of faked it and he fainted on the cross, and then afterwards he was brought to the tomb and he woke up in the tomb, rolled away the rock, snuck past the guards, and escaped. This is called the swoon theory, that Jesus fainted. But the problem with this is that the Romans were really, really good executioners. Like they knew how to kill people. And so they were even so good at it as they made sure that Jesus was dead even after his heart had stopped by piercing him through the side. And another thing is that the apostles didn't see kind of this broken, wounded zombie Jesus that had just barely managed to crawl out of the cave. They saw Jesus fully alive and glorious. Something had happened other than just him fainting. The tomb was also empty. The fact we know this is because the Jewish leaders could have very easily, when the Christians were going around saying, Jesus is alive, Jesus is alive. The first thing I would do if I was one of the Jewish leaders is I would go to his tomb, open it up, take the body out and say, no, he didn't. He's still dead. But they didn't do that. Now, some people say the apostles were able to slip past the guards and steal the body. But the problem with that is that all the apostles were killed because of their belief in the resurrection. So you might be thinking, well, maybe they wanted to steal the body of Jesus and then just, escape and become cult leaders and get all this money and power and fame by starting this new religion. Except none of them did that, right? They all got killed because, and some of them brutally so, because they refused to back down from the truth that Jesus was alive. If they had stolen the body and it was all just this elaborate ruse, they would have cracked under torture immediately. But they didn't do that. They had this newfound courage. The tomb was also empty, and the evidence of women was the first one given that the tomb was empty. Now, this might not seem like a big deal for us today, but back in that time, the evidence of women was not seen as credible. And so if the apostles were making up this story to start a new religion, there's no way they would have had women be the first eyewitnesses at the tomb. The only reason that we know that this is true is because they were more concerned with telling the truth of what actually happened than they were with spinning a creative story. What about the idea that the apostles maybe just hallucinated it? They really wanted to see Jesus back, and so they just hallucinated that Jesus was alive. There was a girl in high school that I really liked, and I was at a party, and I was like trying to impress her, and we started talking about Jesus, and she told me that she thinks that the apostles all just got drunk and were like, oh, let's make up a story about Jesus coming back from the dead. And that's how Christianity got started. This doesn't make sense because 500 people saw Jesus at the same time. Do you know how hard it is to get 500 people to hallucinate the exact same thing at the exact same time? It's pretty much impossible. And when Paul talks about this, he says most of them are still alive. And the reason he writes that is he's saying, go check for yourself. Go talk to them yourself. Go ask them yourself what they saw. They're still alive. Finally, a skeptic and an enemy of Jesus saw him after his resurrection. So you might be thinking, well, maybe the apostles were just wishful thinking, like, oh, we really wish our friend was back. We really wish he came back from the dead. But that's not what the Gospels say. Thomas, when he's told he's alive, he said, no, he's not. People don't come back from the dead. I don't believe it until I put my hand into his side. I want empirical evidence. Paul certainly did not want to see Jesus raised from the dead. He was in fact going around persecuting the church for saying this. He had no reason to change his mind, except if Jesus really was alive. And both of them died a martyr's death, proclaiming to their last breath that Jesus had risen from the tomb and had appeared to them. And so what I want to leave you with is apologetics works. Apologetics works not because we can argue people into the church, but because when we present people with a clear and winsome argument for why Christianity really does have good evidence to back it up, that we don't just believe on faith alone, but that we actually do have good reasons for our belief, it actually works. And so I'll leave that scripture passage up showing how Paul used apologetics to bring people to Christ. And I want you amongst your tables in this next time that we have to discuss to talk amongst yourselves which of those arguments you found most convincing, maybe the one you didn't find as convincing, and make that in your heart, cement that in your heart so that you'll be able to give a clear reason for the hope that is in you.